Today, we are going to see about lateral ventricle and third ventricles. The objectives of today's session is students at the end of the session should be able to enumerate the parts and the relations of both lateral ventricle and third ventricle. During development, in third week, when the neural tube forms, it produces three vesicles in the cranial part. The cranialmost part being called prosencephalon, and the middle part called mesencephalon, and the distal vesicle is called rhombencephalon. The prosencephalon vesicle further differentiates into two lateral telencephalon vesicle and the diencephalon vesicle. The cavity of the primitive neural tube within the telencephalon forms lateral ventricle, and the wall of this neural tube differentiates into cerebrum. So the two lateral ventricles through interventricular foramen of Monro communicates into the diencephalon cavity, which is the third ventricle. Whereas the mesencephalon do not differentiate, it persists as such. In later adult life, it differentiates into midbrain. The rhombencephalon vesicle differentiates into two vesicles again, the proximal being metencephalon, which gives rise to cerebellum and pons, and the distal one becomes myelencephalon, from which medulla oblongata is derived. The cavity within this rhombencephalon forms the fourth ventricle. Now, coming to lateral ventricle, there are two lateral ventricles present in either cerebral hemisphere. It is a she-shaped cavity. The lateral ventricles communicate into the third ventricle through the small interventricular foramen of Monro. And single lateral third ventricle is present, which communicates into the fourth ventricle through this cerebral aqueduct. So the parts of the lateral ventricles are: the anterior part is called anterior horn. Since it extends into the frontal pole, it can be called as frontal horn. This is middle body or parietal part, since it present under the parietal lobe. Last, this is inferior horn or temporal horn, since it extends into the temporal lobe of cerebral hemisphere. The posterior extension is called posterior horn or occipital horn, since it extends into the occipital lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. The part of the lateral ventricle where the body, posterior and the inferior horn meets is called collateral trigone. Before going into the descriptions of lateral ventricle, let's see some of the parts of the cerebrum. So the picture here displays the deep cerebral nucleus. This is caudate nucleus, which is she-shaped, having head, body, and tail. This is lentiform nucleus. The name is derived because of its lens shape. The lateral part is called globus pallidus, and the medial part of the nucleus is called putamen. The reticular structure is the thalamus. Lateral ventricle is she-shaped cavity, and it follows the structure of caudate nucleus. The anterior horn is related to head of the caudate nucleus. The body is related to body of the caudate nucleus. The tail of the caudate nucleus is related to the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, whereas posterior horn of the lateral ventricle is not related to the tail of caudate nucleus. Similarly, the lentiform nucleus is the lateralmost structure. It is not related to the lateral ventricle cavity. And thalamus is the medialmost structure. It is related only to the body of the caudate nucleus as well as body of the lateral ventricle. Thalamus is not related to the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle or posterior horn of the lateral ventricle or inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. The caudate nucleus forms floor for the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, and the body of the caudate nucleus forms the floor of the body of the lateral ventricle, and the tail of the caudate nucleus forms the roof of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. This is cerebral hemisphere, right half. we are seeing from the medial aspect. What is probed here is called septum pellucidum. It is a non-nervous tissue which connects corpus callosum to fornix and rostrum below. This is the interventricular foramen of Monroe through which the lateral ventricle is communicated to the third ventricle. After removing the septum pellucidum, now the probe is present inside the lateral ventricle cavity. Corpus callosum. It is a type of commissural fibers that connects left and right half of the cerebral hemispheres equal region. The parts being rostrum, the anterior-most end is genu, then the body of corpus callosum, and the posterior-most end is called splenium. When the corpus callosum is looked from above, some part of the cerebral hemispheres are removed to show the commissural fiber corpus callosum. Some of the anterior fibers of the corpus callosum forms a U-shaped bundle and connects the equal region of the frontal lobe, forms the forceps minor bundle. Similarly, posteriorly, some of the corpus callosum fibers forms a thick bundle, U-shaped bundle, and connects the equal region of the occipital pole, forming forceps major. So here in the schematic, this is the U-shaped bundle forming forceps minor, and this is the posteriorly formed U-shaped bundle called forceps major. The dotted lines indicates the part of the corpus callosum fiber being intersected by the coronaradiata. So posteriorly, this part of the corpus callosum fiber is not intersected by the corpus callosum fiber, and this part of the corpus callosum fiber forms a structure called tapetum. So tapetum is present only in the posterior part of the corpus callosum, where it is not intersected by the coronaradiata fibers. Now this is fornix. Fornix is considered as the sole efferent fibers arising from the hippocampus. This is the body of fornix. Anteriorly, it ends as columns of fornix. And after opening the septum pellucidum, the third lateral ventricle cavity shows caudate nucleus. This is the region of the thalamus. So third ventricle is present between the two thalamic nuclei. Now let's see about the boundaries of the lateral ventricle. Anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. It extends from genu to interventricular foramen. So anterior horn of the lateral ventricle extends from an genu of corpus callosum through this interventricular foramen of Monroe. The medial wall of the anterior horn is formed by septum pellucidum connecting the body of corpus callosum above through rostrum below. The anterior wall of the lateral ventricle is formed by genu. The roof is formed by body of corpus callosum, whereas its floor is formed by the rostrum part of the corpus callosum. Now, the floor of the anterior horn is formed by head of the caudate nucleus. So the coronal section passing through the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle is related to head of the caudate nucleus, not the body of caudate nucleus, nor the thalamus. So in this schematic, you can see this anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Roof is formed by corpus callosum. Its floor is formed by the rostrum of the corpus callosum. Medial wall bridging the body as rostrum of corpus callosum, which is formed by septum pellucidum. And the lateral wall is formed by head of the caudate nucleus. The third lateral ventricle cavity is lined by ependymal lining. So this is how it looks in the specimen. Coronal section passing through the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, showing roof formed by body of corpus callosum, floor formed by rostrum of corpus callosum, medial wall formed by septum pellucidum, lateral wall formed by head of caudate nucleus, and this is what anterior wall, which is formed by the genu of the corpus callosum. Coming to the body of the lateral ventricle, body of lateral ventricle extends from interventricular foramen of Monro to splenium of corpus callosum. Just like the anterior horn, body of the lateral ventricle, medial wall is also formed by septum pellucidum. Here, septum pellucidum extends from body of corpus callosum through the fornix body. So, roof is formed by body of corpus callosum. Medial wall is formed by septum pellucidum. Coming to the floor of the body of the lateral ventricle is somewhat slopy in form. So this is this image observed from looking into the cavity of the lateral ventricle after removing the superior part of the cerebrum. So this is left side lateral ventricle cavity, this is right side lateral ventricle cavity. The floor of the body of lateral ventricle is slopy, formed by body of caudate nucleus in the lateral aspect and the thalamic nuclei in the medial aspect. There presents a small groove between the body of caudate nucleus and the thalamus, which holds two small structures called thalamostriate vein. This vein drains the thalamus and the striatum part of the deep cerebral nucleus. And one more small white structure, bundle of nerves called stria terminalis. They are seen in this sloping floor. So the slopy floor seen in the coronal section passing through the body of the lateral ventricle includes body of the caudate nucleus as well as the medial most structure thalamus. So this is the floor structure from lateral to medial. Laterally it is formed by body of caudate nucleus. Then in this small groove, this lumen shows thalamostriate vein, and next to that stria terminalis, and this is the thalamus. Floor is formed by the superior surface of the thalamus. This is corpus callosum body which forms the roof. Septum pellucidum connecting body of corpus callosum through the body of fornix structure. So this is a schematic of the body of lateral ventricle. What we saw in the previous slide is from fresh specimen. So here I'll repeat again. The roof is formed by the body of corpus callosum or trunk of corpus callosum. Medial wall is formed by septum pellucidum. Floor is somewhat slopy and it is formed by caudate nucleus body, superior surface of the thalamus. In the small groove, stria terminalis and thalamus striate vein is occupied. The medialmost structure is formed by the body of fornix. So this is a small fissure called choroid fissure present between the thalamus and the body of fornix. Through the choroid fissure, choroid plexus extends into the lateral ventricle body. So this choroid plexus is important structure. It secretes the CSF fluid. Coming to the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle, posterior horn extends into the occipital lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. So here, two structures are to be noted. One is forceps major bundle. The next structure is, in the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, there is a prominent sulcus called calcarine sulcus. Calcarine sulcus, its wall is occupied by the visual area number 17 and 18. So these two important structure produces prominent impression into the ventricle cavity. The roof is formed by tapetum fiber. Tapetum fibers are part of corpus callosum which are not intersected by the corona radiata. So when coronal section is taken through the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle, this is how it looks like. This is the cavity of the posterior horn of lateral ventricle. The roof and the lateral wall is continuous. Similarly, the medial wall and floor is continuous. The roof is formed by tapetum fibers. Still above, optic radiation fibers and inferior longitudinal fascicles forms the roof. The medial wall, two elevations are produced. by the forceps major bundle above and by the deep calcarine sulcus below. This bulging formed by the forceps major bundle is called bulb of posterior horn, and the bulging produced by the deep calcarine sulcus forms calcar avis. These two are the notable structures in the medial wall of the posterior horn of lateral ventricle. This image is showing that we looking into the cavity of the posterior horn of lateral ventricle. Section is taken through this posterior horn of lateral ventricle, coronal section. So medial wall produces, medial wall, two swellings are seen, above one, below one, and this is the lateral wall. So the above swelling is bulb of posterior horn formed by the forceps major bundle, and the lower swelling is produced by the calcarine sulcus, which forms calcar avis. The same posterior horn is looked from the lateral side. So this is the left half of the cerebral hemisphere where the entire lateral wall is removed to show the entire lateral ventricle from lateral aspect. So here is anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, body of lateral ventricle, posterior horn of the lateral ventricle, and this is inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. Other structures that are seen in this view are, this is centromedian fissure, internal capsule, lateral to the internal capsule, lentiform nucleus, and here in the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, hippocampus is seen. Some of the fibers covering the hippocampus form alveus. This alveus converge medially to form wing-like structure called fimbriae. All the fimbriae converges to form the fornix. So this is the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle that is extending into the occipital lobe. It shows two swellings from medial side. The above swelling is formed by forceps major bundle called bulb of posterior horn. The lower swelling is produced by the deep calcarine sulcus forming calcar avis. These two are the important details to be observed in the medial wall of the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Coming to the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, I would like to discuss a few important things in the cerebral hemisphere inferior surface. So this is a frontal lobe of cerebral hemisphere, occipital lobe of cerebral hemisphere. This is the temporal lobe of cerebral hemisphere. In the inferior surface, temporal lobe presents medialmost gyrus called parahippocampal gyrus. Next to the parahippocampal gyrus, it is limited by the deep sulcus called collateral sulcus. So parahippocampal gyrus limited by deep collateral sulcus. These two features produces important findings in the floor of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. When coronal section is taken, passing through the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, it also passes through the body of the lateral ventricle. This is how it looks, coronal section wise, showing both the body of the lateral ventricle as well as the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle passing through the temporal lobe. So what is observed is the slit-like inferior horn of the lateral ventricle cavity into the temporal lobe. This is the parahippocampal gyrus, and this is the deep collateral sulcus. This parahippocampal gyrus rolled into the cavity of the lateral ventricle inferior horn, forms the hippocampus. This collateral sulcus produce a small elevation into the middle wall of the inferior horn of lateral ventricle to form collateral eminence. So the schematic of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle showing a slit-like cavity of the inferior horn of lateral ventricle forming structures forming the roof are epitum, tail of the caudate nucleus, and the stria terminalis neurobundle. Whereas the floor is formed by hippocampus and the collateral eminence produced by collateral sulcus. The hippocampus is covered by a efferent coming arising from the hippocampus called alveus. Alveus converge medially to form a wing-like structure called fimbriae. All these fimbriae only converge to form the fornix. In the same image, we can also observe the choroid fissure present between the fimbriae and the caudate nucleus tip. Through this choroid fissure, blood vessels are protruded into the cavity of the inferior horn of lateral ventricle, carrying the outer covering of the brain, pia mater, and the inner lining of the ventricle, ependyma. So this forms the choroid plexus. So blood vessels are covered here only by pia mater of the brain and the ependymal covering of the ventricle. Medial wall is formed by hippocampus. Hippocampus are covered by outflow coming from the hippocampus called alveus. The alveus converge medially to form fimbriae, and medial wall is also formed by the collateral eminence as swelling produced by the deep collateral sulcus. Lateral wall or roof is formed by neurobundle called stria terminalis, tail of caudate nucleus, and tapetum fibers. What is stria terminalis? It is a neurobundle that connects the amygdaloid region to that of the septal area. The stria terminalis also follows the course of the caudate nucleus. So stria terminalis is related to the lateral ventricle near the body as well as the inferior horn. Stria terminalis is not related to the anterior horn or the posterior. So this is how inferior horn floor looks like. So this is the hippocampus. Anteriorly, hippocampus presents a cat's paw-like structure called pes hippocampus. The hippocampus is covered by fibers arising from the hippocampus called alveus. Alveus converge medially to form wing-like structure called fimbriae. All the fimbriae converge to form the fornix structure. This is collateral eminence produced by the deep collateral sulcus. So summary of the lateral ventricle from anterior horn to inferior horn. Anterior horn extends from genu of the corpus callosum to the interventricular foramen of Monro. Its roof is formed by corpus callosum, floor is formed by rostrum, anterior wall is formed by genu, medial wall is formed by septum pellucidum, lateral wall is formed by head of the caudate nucleus. Body extends from interventricular foramen of Monro to splenium of corpus callosum. Body roof is formed by corpus callosum trunk or body of corpus callosum. Medial wall is formed by septum pellucidum. The floor is sloping, formed by body of caudate nucleus. Thalamus striate vein, stria terminalis is present in the small groove. Then the superior surface of the thalamus, choroid fissure, and the body of the fornix. So, floor is a slopy structure. The posterior horn of the lateral ventricle has medial wall and the medial wall or floor roof or the lateral wall. Medial wall has two swellings. The upper one is produced by the forceps major bundle forming bulb of posterior horn. The lower elevation is produced by the deep calcarine sulcus forming calcareous. Roof is formed by tapetum. Coming to the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, this is a slit-like cavity extends into the temporal pole of cerebral hemisphere. The roof of the inferior horn is formed by tapetum fibers. The floor produces two swellings are formed. The medialmost swelling is produced by parahippocampal gyrus that rolls into the cavity of the inferior horn, forming hippocampus. Another swelling is produced by the deep collateral sulcus forming collateral eminence. Apart from this tapetum fiber, roof also has the tail of caudate nucleus, stria terminalis. The floor consists of hippocampus being covered by alveus converging medially to form fimbriae. From the fimbria arises the fornix. All the cavity of the ventricles are lined by ependymal coverings. Coming to third ventricle. Third ventricle is a slit-like space present between the two thalamic nuclei. So third ventricle is lined anteriorly by lamina terminalis. Lamina terminalis is considered as the anterior end of the neural tube or the most cranial end of the neural tube. It extends from lamina terminalis in the front to aqueduct of Sylvius posteriorly. Anterior wall of the lateral ventricle are formed by the following structures: crura of column of the fornix, lamina terminalis, and anterior commissure. Anterior commissure is a bundle of fibers, a type of commissural fiber that connects both the septal area in both the hemispheres. Posterior wall is formed by pineal gland and posterior commissure. Posterior commissure passes through the inferior stalk of the pineal gland. Floor presents the following structure. From anterior to posterior, they are optic chiasma, tuber cinerarium and infundibular stalk, which suspends the pituitary gland, posterior perforator substance, two oval swellings called mammillary body, and the tegmentum part of the midbrain. The following structures forms the floor of the third ventricle. So, floor of the third ventricle, looking from inferior aspect of the cerebrum. Anterior to posterior, floor of the third ventricle are formed by optic chiasma, tuber cinerarium, infundibulum which suspends the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is removed here. Two oval swellings called mammillary bodies. Posterior perforator substance and the tegmentum part of the midbrain. Lateral wall is formed by thalamic nuclei above and the diencephalon nuclei below. These two are being separated from the faint sulcus called hypothalamic sulcus that extends from interventricular foramen of Monroe to the aqueduct of Sylvius. Roof of the third ventricle, okay, this is formed by a thin layer of ependymal covering that bridges the two thalamic nuclei. So here, this is the floor of the third ventricle. The same third ventricle, roof, seeing after removing the superior half of the cerebral hemisphere. So this is the two thalamic nuclei, which is stretched by the thin layer of ependyma. Third ventricle is present just below this ependymal roof. So it is a slit-like cavity, not wider. Recesses of the third ventricle. Some of the part of the cavity of the third ventricle extends into the nearby structures and forms a small recess. First recess is optic or chiasmatic recess. This is a part of third ventricle which extends into the optic chiasma. Second being infundibular recess as it extends into the infundibulum. Anterior recess or Vulva of ventricle is a part of third ventricle that extends into the interventricular foramen of Monro. Suprapineal recess extends above the pineal gland, and pineal recess extends into the cavity of pineal gland. Coming to circulation of CSF. CSF is produced with the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle and third ventricle. From the lateral ventricle, CSF drained into the third ventricle through interventricular foramen of Monro. From third ventricle, CSF enters into the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius, present within the midbrain. The cavity of fourth ventricle is present behind the pons and the upper medulla. After reaching the fourth ventricle cavity, CSF escapes the fourth ventricle through a foramen present in its roof. The lateral foramen is called foramen of Lashka, and the medial foramen is called foramen of Magendie. Through these foramens in the roof of the fourth ventricle, CSF escapes this cavity and enters into the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space, CSF circulates around the cerebellum, then through the tentorium, CSF fluid circulates around the subarachnoid space of cerebral hemisphere. Very little part of CSF enters into the central canal of spinal cord. The rest of the CSF circulates around the subarachnoid space of spinal cord. So this CSF gets drained by arachnoid granulations. From there, CSF enters into the venous fluid. So the high magnification shows circulation of CSF in the subarachnoid space. From here, through arachnoid granulation, CSF enters into the venous blood of the superior sagittal sinus. Now coming to choroid fissure and choroid plexus. Choroid fissure, it is a C-shaped slit-like gap through which the blood vessels enter into the cavity of the lateral ventricle and third ventricle forms the choroid plexus. So choroid plexus of the lateral and third ventricle. This is a section taken through the body of the lateral ventricle. Choroid fissure is a slit-like space seen here passing between the thalamus and the body of the fornix. Through the interventricular foramen of Monro, choroid plexus enters into the roof of the third ventricle. So this section shows choroid plexus of body of the lateral horn as well as the inferior horn of the lateral horn of the lateral ventricle. So here, choroid fissure passed between the body of fornix and the superior surface of thalamus, carrying the pia mater and the ependymal lining to form choroid plexus. Same way, in the inferior horn also, choroid fissure is present between stria terminalis, tail of caudate nucleus above, to fimbriae and hippocampus below. Through this fissure, blood vessels enter carrying the pia mater and the ependymal lining. Here, important thing to be noted is what is the difference between tila choroidae and choroid plexus. Tila choroidae and choroid plexus. Tila choroidae is nothing but only the ependymal lining and the blood vessels. I'm sorry. Choroid plexus is formed by three structures: blood vessels, ependymal lining, and pia mater. If it is only blood vessels and pia mater, It is called tila choroidae. Plus ependymal lining forms choroid plexus. So this is the entire choroid plexus seen from opening the roof of the lateral ventricle cavity. So choroid plexus is present in the body and the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. Choroid plexus is not present in the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle as well as the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Here, the fissure is extending between thalamus and the body of fornix. In the inferior horn, it is present between hippocampus and tail of caudate nucleus. So here, applied aspect, what is this observed here is normal lateral ventricle cavity seen from MRI. Here the lateral ventricle cavity is dilated. This condition is called hydrocephalus. Hydro, accumulation of fluid, that is cerebrospinal fluid within the cephalus, within the cerebrum. So here is the image of the baby suffering from hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus occurs either due to increased secretion of CSF or decreased absorption of CSF or due to obstruction in the intercommunicating channels. Thank you.